Hello everyone, welcome to Java Tutorials. My name is Kishore. In this video, we will discuss about exception handling. What are exceptions? Exceptions are runtime errors which occur during the execution of the program that might cause your program to terminate abnormally. There are various exceptions that can occur. When you access the database, you might get an SQL exception. When you try to read or write a file, you would get IO exception. When you try to access an array index, and if the index is not valid, you would get array index out of bounds exception. Similarly, there are few exceptions that would occur, like number format exception. Exception can occur whenever you are trying to convert a text that is not a number to a number format. And when you try to have a null value in a reference, then you get a null pointer exception. To deal with these exceptions, there are few keywords provided by Java like try, catch, finally, throw, and throws. Out of these keywords, some of them are blocks. That is, try, catch, and finally are going to have some logics. You need to understand what is the purpose of these keywords, and as per the requirement, you need to write the code. Firstly, you should understand what is a try block, what kind of code you write. In try block, you usually write those codes which might generate an exception, like you're trying to connect to the database. That code you write it in the try block. You're trying to read or write a file. You are trying to access a particular index of an array. Such things you keep it in the try block. In case there is any exception, you should have an handler. Catch block is actually an handler that is executed if the try block generates an exception. So in the catch block, you can have an exception handling logic. As try can generate one or more exceptions depending on the statements you have written, you can have one or more catch blocks after the try. Then comes the finally block. Finally block is not mandatory to write. It is an optional block. When the finally block is executed is, it is executed if exception is generated or not. It is going to be always executed. Means you can always use the finally block to write such codes that has to be executed mandatorily, even if exception occurs or doesn't occur, or even if exception is handled or not handled. It could be like in the try block, you are trying to open a connection of a database or open a file, and you want to release the database resources or you want to close the files. Such codes, you always keep it in the finally block because no matter what happens, the resources will be released or files will be closed mandatorily. Then comes the throw keyword. The throw keyword is mainly used whenever you want to explicitly generate an exception based on some criteria. Like you want to generate an exception when a particular condition is met. Usually you use the throw keyword to explicitly generate a custom exception. Like we have some inbuilt exceptions. In application, you may want to create your own exceptions and you want to generate them. Think of an example like you are trying to withdraw an amount, and whenever you are withdrawing an amount, there could be chance that balance is not sufficient for the amount you want to withdraw. In that case, you can throw one exception called insufficient balance exception, correct? So in order to manually throw that exception, what you can do, you can use the throw keyword and you can generate the exception when certain condition is met. Then comes the throws keyword. What is this throws keyword used for is it is used whenever a method doesn't want to handle the exception, rather it wants to delegate the exception to its caller. So that caller will be responsible to handle the exception. Consider a scenario like developers wants to apply leave. Usually what happens, developer himself will not approve the leave, correct? What developers would do is they are going to forward the application request to their managers, and managers are going to be responsible to approve the leave. So that is how the throws keyword work. A method would not handle the exception because it will not have an idea how to handle it. Rather, it will forward the exception to its caller so that caller will know how to handle it. And these exceptions are nothing but objects in Java. And there are some exception classes which come under certain classes. So let us see what is the exception hierarchy. The main thing is here the exception class, which has many subclasses like SQL exception, IO exception, and all. Exception is a subclass of throwable, and the throwable has two subclasses, error and exception. Why there are two subclass? Whenever exception occurs or error occur, they would terminate the program abnormally. But exceptions you can handle. However, errors you cannot handle. Errors are some hardware failures or software failures. Like handling errors will not make any sense. Assume that you are trying to create an object and the memory is not available. Handling that error will not make any sense because after handling that error, again an object will be created. Still, you will get that error called memory is not sufficient. So for that reason, errors are categorized separately, which you cannot handle. But exceptions you can handle. So that if you handle the exception, the rest of the codes will be still executed. Throwable is a subclass of object. And then coming to exception, it has many subclasses like SQL exception, IO exception, class not found exception, runtime exception, and runtime exception has subclasses like array index out of bounds exception, arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, number format exception, and class cast exception. And IO exception has a subclass called file not found exception. So why there are these many exception means we need to understand that there are different types of errors, that is runtime error, which can be generated in the application. Whenever you are trying to access the database, a particular exception called SQL exception will be generated. When you try to access a file to read or write, IO exception will be generated, correct? That's why there are various categories. Coming to the types of exceptions. When it comes to types of exceptions, there are two types of exceptions. One is the checked exception and another is unchecked exception. Now you might be thinking why there are two types of exceptions. What is this checked and what is unchecked means? Checked exceptions needs to be handled at the compilation time only because there could be chance that these exceptions might occur sometimes in the program. Though those are not the mistakes in the program, but they can occur sometimes. Like when you are trying to access a database, that statement might not always be successful. What if the database is down? In that case, an SQL exception will be generated. And if it is generated, you should always have an handler to handle it, correct? Suppose you are trying to access a file, and what if that file is temporarily unavailable for some minutes? In that case, the statement will generate an exception called file not found exception. So that is why it will not always occur. It might occur sometimes. And for that reason, you should always recover from such exceptions. So for that reason only, the checked exceptions are going to be handled at the compilation time only so that your programs will be always recoverable. They are not program's mistake. Next is unchecked exceptions are the mistakes in the program itself. Those are like bugs which are not fixed during the development. Like you are trying to access an element that is not actually present in the array index. Maybe you are accessing an invalid index. Those things are programmer's mistake. The programmer can always avoid those mistakes, right? That's why they are called as unchecked exceptions. Like array index out of bounds exception occur whenever you access the element from an invalid index. So what you can do is you can always write a code so that you would access the element which is going to be from a particular index within the range of the index from 0 to length minus 1 of that array. And then arithmetic exception will occur whenever you're trying to divide a number by 0. And what you can do is you can write a condition. The division should be done only if that divider is not 0. Only then you want to execute that statement. Then you will never get an arithmetic exception. Null pointer exception is something you can handle by checking a reference is not equal to null. If you do not check that, then you try to access any method, you will get a null pointer exception because reference is having null. So you can write a condition, reference not equal to null means you can avoid that null pointer exception. That is why these are the exceptions that come under unchecked exceptions. And the compiler will not force you to handle at the compilation time. But whenever you are trying to connect to the database or trying to access a file, compiler will force you to keep those statements within try catch. To understand how these exception handling keywords like try catch finally is going to work, let us write one simple program. In this video, only one program we will write. And in the next videos, we will discuss about throws, keywords, checked, unchecked exceptions with an example. Let's write one code here like int number equals to 10 and int number 2 equals to 0. And I will write result equals to number 1 divided by number 2, and I will write result equals result, and we will print rest of the code goes here. We know that we are dividing a number by 0 because number 2 value is 0. You might ask that I am hard coding it and always it is going to generate an error. Yes, of course. But what if these numbers are read from the keyboard through the scanner class? And what if this number is a result by some arithmetic operation and that result might be 0? Then if you are dividing a number by that 0, you will get an exception, right? That is what you have to assume. Now I have this number 1, 10, and number 2, 0. If I run this program, here the result won't print because here itself the exception occurs that is called as an arithmetic exception and there is no handler. In that case, what happens? The program will abruptly terminate and remaining things will not be executed. If I run this program, I would get arithmetic exception divide by 0, and it also tells at which line number an exception occurred. You can see here it is telling test exception handling java file and main method inside the test exception handling class, which is inside the package com.examples, an exception occurred. And at 8th line, what is there? This is the statement that caused the exception, and console is not printing any of these things because exception occurred. Let me now create a scanner object and take the input from the keyboard. So you all know how to create a scanner object and why you use the scanner object, correct? So I'm creating a scanner object, and then what I do, I ask user enter the value to the number 1, and this value I will take from the keyboard. Next, I will ask user enter number 2, and number 2 value I will take from the keyboard. Let me divide number 1 by number 2 and print the value. And this is giving warning. We will close that probably after taking the input. We will close that as well. And we will just print the result after dividing. Now, if I run the program, it will ask me to enter number 1. Let me enter 10, and number 2, I will enter 2. Result is 5. Rest of the code goes here. Let me rerun the program. This time I will write 10 and number 2 as 0. I get an exception. And when I get an exception, what happened was here the exception occurred and it abnormally terminated because there is no handler, and because of that the rest of the codes were not executed. And how do you avoid it? It is programmer's mistake because we are not checking any condition. Number 2 should not be equal to 0. Then only do this job. That we are not writing. But let us see how to use the try catch finally block here. What I will do is I will write those codes that might generate an exception in the try block. Which is that code? This is the code. And I want to print the result. This is the code to print the result. I will write the try block and keep these two lines inside the try block. You might think that why result you are printing in the try block. Obviously, I need to access that in the try block because I am declaring it here itself. Then after the try, you can have a catch block. So catch block is written like this. In the parenthesis, you need to pass what kind of exception you want to handle. We are getting arithmetic exception, so we will handle arithmetic exception. And what you can do is you can print what is the exception by using one of the method present in every exception class. What is that method is e dot print stack trace is the method. It is going to print all the exception messages including the line numbers and including in which particular class, everything. Then you can write the finally block here that is going to close the scanner class, and we will print here finally block is executed. But you need to understand finally block is executed always regardless of whether exception handled or not. If I run the program now, what happens is it will ask me to enter the number. Let me enter the number 10 and I will enter the number 2 5. Look at the result, it is printing 2. Finally block is executed and rest of the code goes here as the value of number 2 is not 0, result will be 2, and catch block is not executed, but finally block is still executed, and remaining part of the code is executed because it is normal termination. Let's see what happens if an exception occurs. I will enter number 1, that is 10, and number 2 as 0. Exception occurs, and catch block is printing this stack trace telling that which line number and what is the exception name, that is arithmetic exception, and the line number is 13. At 13th line we got an exception. Later you can observe finally block is executing and the rest of the code goes here also printing. It means exception handled. For that reason only it is actually printing this statement. What I will do, I will not handle the exception. I will just keep the try block and I will remove the catch block. Will it work? Yes, it will work. Remember, it's not that you should always write a catch block after the try. You can write try and later finally, so that once the try block is executed, if there is any exception, finally will be definitely executed and the program will terminate. You can write the code like this also. If I run this program, what happens? Let's see. Let me enter number 10 and 0. Look at the final block, it is still executing and there is no catch block. But you might be thinking, who is printing this message? And rest of the code goes here is not printing. So you need to observe here this arithmetic exception, who is printing. What happens is when the exception occurs, JVM is going to find the handler. If there is no handler, what happens is JVM will automatically handle that exception and terminate the program. And since it handled the exception, it is going to tell what is the exception that occurred. But if JVM handles the exception, it doesn't actually run the program smoothly, it terminates the program. Because of that, it is actually not printing this statement. This program is just to understand how the try catch finally works, and also you can write the finally block without a catch. But one thing is you cannot write just a single try block. You should either write a try with catch or try with finally. And what you also can write is you can just write a try catch and you don't need to write finally. That is also valid. Let me write that. Let me write catch with arithmetic exception, then I will write e dot print stack trace. It's not mandatory to write a finary block. If I run the program and if I enter 10 and 0, an arithmetic exception occurred and rest of the code goes here is also printing. It means the program is normally terminating, and these messages are printing in between that you can ignore because JVM is the one who is actually executing the catch block, and the print stack trace is executed by a different thread, and the print statement is executed by a different thread. Since they are running concurrently, the print statements are appearing like this, and each time you might get that order differently. Let me again run. See, now this time the order is different. That is because multiple threads are running. Here an exception thread is printing, and here the JVM main thread is printing. So that is it about the try, catch, and finary block. In the next video, we will discuss about the other things like checked exception, unchecked exception, throw, and throws. Thank you so much. See you in the next video.